Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this webinar this morning as part of Net Zero Week on why Net Zero needs nuclear. My name is Tom Greatrix. I'm Chief Executive of the Nuclear Industry Association. I'll be chairing today's panel session. The NIA Nuclear Industry Association, for those of you who may not be aware, is the trade association for the UK civil nuclear industry, and we represent 250 or so companies across the supply chain. Today we're going to talk about Net Zero as part of Net Zero Week. This is the first Net Zero Week, which is the UK's national awareness raising week on Net Zero. So I've said Net Zero and Net Zero Week enough times. I hope that when I say that the website where you can find more information on other events and webinars that are happening during the course of this week is netzeroweek.com. And there's a lot going on and some interesting stuff to dip in and out of, but today we're going to focus on nuclear energy's contribution to net zero and why it's a significant part of that agenda. We've got a fantastic panel this morning to give their views, and then we'll move on to questions from the audience, which will be the majority of the session. We want this to be an interactive session. Both can get the insight and experience of panelists and to answer as many of your questions as possible. If you do have a question, don't wait until I say, right, we're going to go to questions now. As soon as anything strikes you based on what people say or what you join to find out about or ask about, please just use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And what we'll do is we'll try to make sure that we answer as many of them as we can in the time we've got available. And if we run out of time, we will endeavour to try to get you an answer after the event as well, if we're able to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce our panelists before their each of them before their introductory remarks. One of our panelists will join us at about 10:30. So I think this will probably work out in terms of people's opening remarks and timing. But if not, we might do a couple of questions before we come to our final panelist. But our first speaker this morning is Charlotte Nicholls. Charlotte's a Member of Parliament for Warrington North. Elected in December 2019, the last general election. Prior to being elected to Parliament, Charlotte was the National Research and Policy Officer for the GMB Union, and one of her policy focuses was industrial policy around a just transition and all things to do with energy and the energy industry. And obviously the GMB, those who know it know that it's a union that's had a long history and continuing work in the energy sector. Charlotte's a member of the BEIS Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Select Committee, holding that government department to account in Parliament. She's also co-chair of the Nuclear All-Party Parliamentary Group and an officer of the Hydrogen All-Party Parliamentary Group, as well as being on the front bench as Shadow Minister for Women and Equalities. Charlotte.
Thank you ever so much for that, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning in Net Zero Week, because I think as Thomas sort of outlined in his opening remarks, nuclear is a key part of net zero. I think from my own constituency point of view, as the MP for Warrington North, I have around 4,500 people that work in the civil nuclear industry, and it's a number that's growing every year. And we've seen from projects which are coming down the pipeline, including Sizewell C, the potential for even further growth. Now, for me, as much as nuclear is a key part of the drive to net zero, I think it's also really important to look at it as part of how we build back better and build back greener after the coronavirus pandemic. In my own constituency, around a quarter of people in the workforce work in the retail distribution sector, which is a sector that is dominated by low pay, poor terms and conditions, and 0 hours contracts, which is in stark contrast to the nuclear sector in the area, which is providing high quality degree apprenticeships for the young people in our town, working closely with our University Technical College, with the university that we have in Warrington, the University of Chester. And actually, fundamentally, within the town itself, being a really important contributor to a lot of the third sector work that's going on locally. Sellafield, for example, are one of the key sponsors of the Fernhead Food Pantry. And so it's clear that in terms of our local economy, it's not only a contributor to strong terms and conditions, a proper career in the sector, jobs that tend to be unionised, but it's also helping to sort of level up, if you like, areas like mine. In terms of the just transition, as Tom said, as a member of the Base Select Committee, we've been working very closely with government in the lead up to COP26 later this year. And I think that one of the things that's really important to note is actually that if you look at our economy over the last decade or so, the share of renewables has massively increased, while the number of green jobs has actually gone down, because without a industrial strategy that looks at all areas of how we decarbonise our economy, it's clear that sort of greening our economy in and of itself isn't going to support employment, and I think ultimately takes away from the public consent for the massive changes that we're going to need to see as a society. So nuclear has the largest employment multiplier by far of any form of zero or low carbon energy generation. It's a way of making sure that we don't exacerbate the issues with fuel poverty that we've seen in the country. And as Tom alluded to in terms of my role on the all-party parliamentary group for hydrogen, it's actually got some great synergies there with how we decarbonise heat and how we decarbonise the gas sector, as of course pink hydrogen can be a byproduct of nuclear. So I think we need to look at it not only in terms of that reliable baseload in our energy mix and the fact that, this is providing jobs in areas of the country which have been left behind for a long time. The science and expertise that means that the people that are working in this field can be greening other parts of the economy too, using the technical and scientific expertise that they've gained through working in the nuclear sector. But clearly it helps with other parts of our just transition as well. And I think, being last week, I think it was, I was at the Jacobs Nuclear Laboratory in Birchwood in my constituency, and seeing some of the absolutely mind-blowing innovation work that's taking place there. It's really clear that from my point of view, nuclear isn't something that's, just for the upcoming fleet. This is something that can be a technology that takes us right into the future and is something that helps us as we establish our place in the global market, post-Brexit, something that can be an exportable technology that helps to green the rest of the world as well as just the UK. So it's one of those things I could sort of talk about forever, and I apologise for a sort of lack of sharpness this morning, perhaps in being concise, having had about an hour's sleep last night because I'm far too ginger for this weather. But I'm really looking forward to the discussion today and to listening to the other panelists, and also sort of contributions from people that are taking part in the webinar. So thanks very much for having me, and happy Tuesday.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much indeed, Charlotte. I don't think you're the only person who may have found warm weather not great, conducive for a good night's sleep. But thank you for your opening remarks. So next speaker is Lindsay Broadwell. Lindsay is a councillor for and Leicester City Councillor, but she's here because she's I think describes her here as a freelance advocate for nuclear energy, somebody who has an interest and a fascination with the technology, the subject, the application, with a particular eye to human progress and environmental and social justice. So I'm going to ask Lindsay to make some opening remarks. Lindsay.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. It's wonderful to see such a well-attended session this morning, and there's some very interesting, very luminary people I'm sharing the stage with. So thank you very much for inviting me to be part of it. My honest perspective when it sort of comes to nuclear energy is I started off my career looking at going into engineering. I went to Loughborough University to study a foundation year in science and engineering. And during my time there, I was looking at the challenge of climate change, and I was, spending an awful lot of sleepless nights trying to work out, how are we going to make this work? How are we going to get to net zero? How are we going to maintain, some semblance of worthwhile human civilization while facing down this existential threat, which comes entirely from the way that, modern civilization is powered, which 85% of global primary energy is from fossil fuels. And in addition to this, this kind of like turned me on to civil nuclear energy, which is something I hadn't ever really considered before. And it's something that honestly doesn't get talked about enough, because when you hear, especially recently, discourse on the matter that we have, 10 years to rapidly decarbonize our economy in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change, I started looking at, well, what kind of technologies have done that before? And the honest answer to that is there is a perfect precedent for how to do this, which is what France did under the Mesmer Plan through the 1970s and 1980s, which is they used an enormous amount of state investment to build, I think it was two basic designs of nuclear reactor, the 900 megawatt CPY series and the 1300 megawatt P4 series. But what also interests me about that is building these things en masse. That is a tremendous economic boost. That provides, cheap, clean, dependable electricity 24/7 with no carbon emissions. And that is in itself is an enabler of enormous swathes of the economy, because not only do you have massive economic contributions from the construction phase, from operation, from fuel processing, from reprocessing, waste disposal, it's an absolutely fantastic driver for the economy. And I think looking at the sort of post-COVID world we're going into, that's what we need. And when I look at plans that are coming out for, here's our economic recovery, an awful lot of lip service gets paid to climate change and greening our economy and dealing with the existential challenges we face. But the ambition, I find, just isn't there. And speaking personally, I'm 26 and I've been working freelance job to freelance job to freelance job my entire career so far. And I've seen firsthand, in Leicester, all the impacts of industrial decline, of, the death of traditional industry. And when you look at what's replacing it, it is retail parks, it's 0 hours warehouse work, it's Amazon working people to death. We have a very real problem with quality of employment in this country, and mass investment in the nuclear industry is one of the ways to change that. Because these are good jobs, they're skilled, they're highly paid, they're secure, they're unionized, they tick every single box you should be looking at when you take into account the economic strength of the country. And so when you marry that to the challenge of climate change, my position I've argued for many years now is we need, sort of a very strong, very intense reignition of ambition across all levels of government to say, well, how do we deal with this challenge? Because the simple truth is that, while some people advocate sort of deindustrialization and energy efficiency and overall reducing the amount of energy that we need in our lives, I'm looking at weather like it is now, and I'm saying, this is only going to get worse. We're going to have more heat waves. They're going to be more intense. And almost nowhere in Britain has air conditioning. And so if we don't solve that problem, you're going to get an awful lot of people dying. And what does air conditioning need? Electricity. So whatever we do, we're going to need more electricity going forwards. And business as usual, that's going to come from gas. There's going to be a smattering of solar panels and, wind turbines, which is all very well and good. I think the wind and solar industry has done fantastic things. But nuclear really is the missing piece that we need to build back better, to get to net zero, to provide, safe, secure employment for thousands upon thousands of people, and also to provide a real economic boost to this country. And speaking on a personal level, I think that the government, for very many years now, under, unfortunately, both of the main political parties, has failed to invest meaningfully in the civil nuclear industry. You look back at the 1990s at how we've got the lone pressurized water reactor at Sizewell B, which that was supposed to be a series of reactors, and then electricity was privatized and the finance disappeared. So we ended up with a one-off, and it was very expensive. And those plans never came to fruition. You look at, all the innovations we have made in nuclear technology that never got taken advantage of. We invented TRISO fuel. We invented an awful lot of innovations in the field of high temperature nuclear reactors. And most recently, Moltex Energy, a UK-based company, has had to go to Canada looking for funding to develop their stable salt reactor, which was originally designed with the brief for disposing of Britain's plutonium stockpiles. So I come in with the perspective that we have an awful lot of the ingredients we need for a really successful nuclear industry, for a really powerful contribution to the economy, to solving climate change. We need the government to actually put these pieces in place and to head on, forwards with ambition and vision, which we sadly see too little of at the moment. And I think an entire generation of people like me who've been working poorly paid jobs, insecure conditions, often not unionized, I think would really appreciate the economy developing in that direction, not just for ourselves, but for future generations who'll have to deal with the consequences of climate change. Thank you. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed, Lindsay, and thanks for your perspective. Our next panelist is Ben Britton, Dr. Ben Britton, who is an expert in materials science and engineering. with an interest in nuclear power. He directed the MSc course in nuclear engineering at Imperial College for 5 years, and was deputy director for the Centre for Nuclear Engineering at Imperial while he was there, and has engaged in policy discussions and academic research over many years in this area. He's now an associate professor at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, as well as being visiting reader at Imperial still. And so he is somebody else who joins this theme of probably not having much sleep, given that I think it's quite late in the evening where you are, Ben. So thank you very much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Tom, and hello, friends and colleagues in the UK and beyond. It's a great pleasure to hear the argument move forward by both Charlotte Nichols MP and Councillor Lindsay Broadwell towards the opportunities of nuclear to create this sort of sustainable job strategy, investment in the economy and beyond. I often start these panel discussions with sort of justifying nuclear in the landscape. As mentioned, I have a technical expertise in understanding specifically the nuclear fuel cycle amongst other energy generation technologies. Just as a very brief point, we've got sort of 3 aspects to the nuclear economy to sort of think about in the here and now, or perhaps here in 15 years. 2050 is not a long time away, I think, is something I should first phrase. Specifically, if we look in the current generation, so at the moment, the UK generates approximately 20% of its electricity. Just one of the caveats here is there's a difference between energy generation, a significant amount of that is for heat, and electricity generation, which is perhaps more useful for many other aspects in terms of, for instance, air conditioning, dealing with heat in some respects, but also in terms of transport, in terms of creation of food, in terms of support of hospitals. A whole range of underpinning society is upon this relatively ease of use of electricity. As we move forward, we've got effectively that 20%, which is going to reduce. It's going to reduce as the advanced gas reactor fleet is switched off. And we've seen this most recently with the Dungeness, I think, such as B switch off that happened at sort of end of life to manage that successfully. That's been switched off. That was as recently, I think, as June 8th or thereabouts. So really in the news. This is only going to happen more and more. And that's each of those reactor switch off effectively is going to reduce that 20% of low carbon, i.e. that the net contributor towards climate change, that CO2 or CO2 equivalents, that nuclear is an underpinning part of those contributions. As we move forward, we're going to be left, I think it's around sort of 2035, where the last of the sort of nuclear reactors will be Sizewell B, which is just by this Sizewell Tea coffee shop. It's just down the beach in this. The Sizewell B reactor has been briefly introduced by Lindsay. It's a pressurized water reactor. It's just a different technology. It creates steam in the system, and that steam effectively drives a generator, and that generator creates the electricity that we know and love. So what do we do to replace those reactors? Well, we have to do new build. And so that's the immediate phase. That's the Hinkley Point C reactor that will generate 3.2 gigawatts of electricity. I phrase that in the UK as roughly consuming something between something like 38 and 45 gigawatts, just to give you a flavor of the contribution. So Hinkley Point C, although we see it as this very expensive part of the UK economy, it is going to contribute enough electricity for about 6 million homes across the UK. So it's a significant contributor that's going to last between 60 and perhaps 100 years of that technology. So it's an investment for our future, not only in jobs, but also displacing fossil fuels, restricting that creation of greenhouse gases that will create the extreme heat waves that are being experienced in the UK. And we talked about the cost on life. That is going to be inequitable. Air conditioning is fantastic, but is only afforded by the rich. That's not only the rich in UK society, but there are lots of other countries where the heat wave around the world, including on the continent of Africa, where there is a significant poverty and death constituted by effectively the West's pollution of the atmosphere in this global challenge moving forward. So we've got the new build phase. So Hinkley Point C is pushing ahead. It had one of the largest crane operations. The nerd in me saw the crane. It's really, really cool to see this huge thing being constructed. Borrowing on, it's no longer first of a kind. There are reactors in China and some around the world. Of course, people have seen headlines love a good story in the nuclear industry. So of course, the Taishan reactor had some incidents associated with the nuclear fuel. it was safely shut down, and effectively they're addressing that challenge moving forward because nuclear learns as it progresses. And that's one of the things that the UK industry will benefit from, that global learning in this area. We then have to create the financial instruments to enable us to invest in hopefully the Sizewell C reactor, most likely through a regulated asset-based model that enables effectively a reduction of the state aid contribution and creates something that is more akin to, for instance, dealing with London's sewage. So it's an experienced financial asset model that effectively enables us to invest in our economy and move low carbon forward. Beyond that, well, the questions are we going to invest in Wilfra in Wales? Are we going to invest in Bradwell with Chinese investment supporting that global challenge? Or are we going to move towards the small modular reactors? These smaller modular reactors are something between of the order of 50 gigawatts. So that's, let me get this right, 100th-ish of the size of Hinkley, up to say 600 megawatts electrical, which is the proposed thing led by the Rolls-Royce grouping of companies in this area. The cool thing there is that those reactors will fit nicely on the advanced gas reactor sites and the sorry, my brain's gone slightly wrong. The existing smaller reactors, not molten salts, the smaller reactor sites for magnesium-based fuels, etc. Yeah, sorry, brain's gone blank on that one. Existing sites around the UK, and that's important for electricity grid connections moving forward. The challenge there is, of course, it is a relatively new design built on sort of old ideas. It will be a water reactor for the Rolls-Royce-led consortia, and that has a challenge to effectively go through regulation process appropriately. This takes time. It's a 10-year challenge moving forward. 2050 is not far away. And so that's the real thing. The investment is critically important now to address the switch off the reactor, because as mentioned, the only things coming to the table to replace the nuclear contribution are going to be gas in that immediate balancing act in that time for that. So those are the things moving forward. I'm happy to talk about the details of what the future may look like, happy to talk about now, and also happy to talk about the legacy of our past if we so wish the conversation to move that way, and other bits and pieces in the space. Thank you for your time.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Ben, and quite a lot of ground covered there. I've seen that's provoked a few points and questions, so we'll get to those relatively soon. But just a reminder to everybody who's on the webinar this morning, if you have questions or points or comments you want to make, if you could use the Q&A function box at the bottom of your screen, and then we'll try to get as many of those asked and answered for you as possible before we finish. But I'm delighted to say that our final speaker has now joined us, Trudy Harrison MP, who's the Member of Parliament for Copeland in West Cumbria. Was elected in February 2017 at a by-election and subsequently re-elected at the two general elections we've had since then. But before being in Parliament, Trudy started her career at the Sellafield nuclear site, so she's very familiar with the industry and the West Cumbrian aspect of it. In Parliament, she's been a member of the Education Select Committee. She's co-chair of the Apprenticeship Delivery Board. She's a member of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Nuclear Energy, the APPG for Autism, and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. That's three separate groups. Trudy is also Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Prime Minister. So got a wealth of knowledge and background prior to being elected to Parliament, and also very involved in lots of the things we've been talking about this morning. So if I can hand over to Trudy to give us some opening remarks before we go to questions. Trudy.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thanks to the Nuclear Industry Association for all that you do. Since being elected in February 2017, I have worked alongside the Nuclear Industry Association and many other organisations supporting our industry, and without which we would really be in a difficult place. I was elected very much on a strong mandate to secure a nuclear future for Copeland. It was by far and away the biggest, greatest, most influential priority in my Copeland constituency. We are the centre of nuclear excellence. We want to stay that way. So 2017, I think one of my earliest debates in Westminster Hall was celebrating the launch of the nuclear sector deal. In 2018, And then by 2019, we had a commitment in government to reach net zero by 2050. We were one of the first G7 countries to do so. Now I'm delighted to say that all G7 countries have aligned to that target and have got really ambitious plans for decarbonisation. Also, I think that year we had the Energy White Paper launch, 2019. And then in 2020, the NIA and NIC launched the 40 by 50, which I think is really critical. 40 gigawatts by 2050. Easy to say, not easy to do. Particularly when you look at the power stations that are coming offline, and forgive me if I'm repeating old ground. I missed the first 25 minutes because I was on a cabinet call. In fact, I've sacrificed the last 5 minutes of cabinet to speak with you all. And actually, it was a brilliant cabinet because we were learning about COP, which is happening in November, just 100 days to go. And also Kwasi was speaking about energy and Grant Shapps about the decarbonisation of transport strategy. So this government really, really is in tune with decarbonisation. And I would also say that we're in tune with nuclear. When the Prime Minister announced his plan for 10 points to a green industrial revolution, I jumped for joy to see that point 3 was a commitment to small modular reactors, advanced modular reactors, and gigawatt plus reactors. So there is no doubt that there is that high level commitment from the Prime Minister, from government, from BEIS. But we're going to lose Hinkley Point B, we're going to lose Heysham, we're going to lose Hartlepool, we'll be losing Torness, Dungeness, and these are power stations in fairly remote rural locations. So in terms of levelling up, I think it really flies against that aim, to be honest. But the brilliance is that we are way ahead with our knowledge and expertise and safe track record of operating gas-cooled reactors. A big part of Grant Shapps' strategy involves hydrogen and looking at how we can use high temperature reactors to produce hydrogen in the future for heavy fleet, for whether it's going into homes. I think we've got 23 million homes on the gas network. I could be a million or so out, but it's somewhere about there. But at the moment, we've just got a commitment to 5 gigawatt production capacity of hydrogen. If there's any talk of mixing hydrogen into the gas system, as was the case with the old town gas, we're going to need a massively ramped up hydrogen production capacity. So with high temperature reactors, I think there's a huge opportunity. We have got a great track record so far with the UK SMR consortium. And now the critical thing, I think, is the siting policy, obviously the financing policy. And I've got a meeting with John Glenn in the next few days, actually, to be fairly critical, quite frankly, because nuclear has been left out of the green investment strategy. I think the advice came from HSBC. I want to be clear about that. But my understanding from speaking with investors and speaking with big nuclear corporations, that this was advice that wasn't best placed. So we want to ensure that nuclear is seen as a green technology for investments, for jobs, and by our public. That really brings me on to a call to action for anybody wanting to promote nuclear. BEIS have what's called, I think, a kind of a public feeling about energy. It has a much more catchy name than that. Somebody tell me what the name is. Basically, it's analysing what the public think of various power generation. And at the moment, 2021, 4 out of 10 people are supportive or generally happy with nuclear. 2 out of 10, so 4 out of 10 support, 2 out of 10 oppose. If that is the feeling of the general public, thank you, Lucy, it's the Public Attitude Survey. If that is the feeling of the general public, that is also echoed by parliamentarians. So if only 4 out of 10 parliamentarians out of the 650 or so that are in Parliament making decisions about how we're going to generate power of the future, how we're going to finance power of the future, we've got a problem. And I've been in so many brilliant nuclear organisation meetings where we talk to ourselves about how fantastic we are. I've said this so many times, and I know that EDF and others are really starting to take action. We must try and speak to the public more. And you employ so many bright and brilliant young people. I know that young people in particular want to work in the nuclear industry because they see it as doing the right thing. Environmental credentials are really important to the under 25s. They're working in your industry because they're proud to do so. But one of the great challenges is the security. You know, don't tell people where you work. Don't go to the pub and say you work at Sellafield. Don't bring your children into this environment. Don't tell people what you do. Is basically the narrative that certainly we set out at Sellafield, and that has to change. If we can't take our children into the environment we work, how are we going to best inspire them? If we can't speak to the public about the great work that we do, how can we spread the message? If we don't spread the message to the public, how will parliamentarians ever get on side and, more importantly, set the pressure that's needed upon government? Because Charlotte and myself, Virginia Crosby, we're one of the few, we like to call ourselves the atomic kittens, who champion the nuclear industry. But we need so many more parliamentarians and members of the public on side, understanding nuclear, and absolutely getting that this has been the greatest achievement for transition from carbonized to low carbon industries. It's proven, it's massive. We've got a track record of doing it. The export potential is huge. The levelling up potential is well understood, but we need more people talking about it, particularly those people who are doing it. So big call to all you who are employing people in your organisation, set them free to talk about it, obviously bearing in mind those security constraints. You can be absolutely sure that the Prime Minister is a huge supporter of nuclear and that this government is committed. But what we need more of a push on is the regulated asset base, about how we're going to fund it, and some conversations about where the siting policies need to be. And anybody that knows me would know that I would like to see a few Gantt charts where we clearly identify the actions and the times about how we'll follow that critical path to a strong nuclear future as we hit that net zero by 2050 target. I've been really delighted to have worked alongside the industry, academia and organisations over the past few months as we've pulled together our roadmap for nuclear. And the big asks really are that the government set out a clear intention so that the private sector can confidently invest in nuclear power stations and energy hubs. And that's really, really important, because none of this will work if we just rely on the Treasury. It will require massive public sector investment. And that's why we need that strong message from government right at the top. We also need the funding mechanism for the large scale gigawatt plus, and looking at the fleet approach, because making sure that we get the best value for money. Nuclear will never be cheap, but it could be oh so much better value than has previously been. And that's a real key request that we've got as well. We launched our roadmap and presented to the Energy Minister, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, just a few weeks ago, and we'll make sure that we keep the pressure on across government. And I know I'm in a good position to do that. Thank you so much again, NIA, for inviting me here today and for working alongside me. I couldn't do this without you, and thousands upon thousands of high-paid, highly skilled jobs depend on you and what you do. So keep doing what you're doing. Thanks, Tom.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Trudy. Thanks for that. And just for those of you who may not be aware, but we will be running a Nuclear Week in Parliament in September, where we are very much focused on trying to increase the litter of atomic kittens beyond those that Trudy mentioned. And seriously though, the point about the public attitude survey is very well made by Trudy. But there's been quite a lot of questions and points that have that have come in on the chat and on the Q&A box, please keep putting those in as we speak. But just given Trudy's remarks and the point she was finishing on in terms of influencing, there's a question from John Idris Jones, who many of you will know. Thanks very much for joining us, John, who's asking us, I suppose, a challenge back or a follow back, which I'll put to you first, Trudy, but then to others as well, which is how can we, and I think by we, I think John means everybody who's involved here and people who are supportive and want to see things happen. How can we influence government to make the right decisions for new nuclear? What do we, beyond the roadmaps that you talked about and the things we try to do, what is it we don't do, we should do? What could we be doing? What more do we need to do to try to help government make the right decisions? If I start with you, Trudy, and then I'll give everybody else a chance to throw in their views on that as well.
I think it's just really important to recognise that people who make decisions in Parliament, parliamentarians, members of Parliament, MPs, are only influenced by the general public. We're a democracy. We do basically what the public wants us to do, but the public isn't calling for more nuclear power stations by and large. So it's much more about a conversation with influencers, YouTube influencers, and the general public. Also, I think it's important that the industry is honest about what will happen when we lose 6.5 gigawatts from those power stations I just referenced there. What will happen if we lose the nuclear skills? What did happen after we built Sizewell B until the point that we committed to Hinkley Point C? It's been bloody expensive. We've had to upskill and retrain so many people. If we develop that fleet build approach and the industry gets to advise government and people making decisions on the value of a fleet build approach, I mean, it's obvious. You look at every other sector, manufacturing, car making, house building, fleet build approach saves money. It would do the same in nuclear. But in Britain, over the past few decades, we've been almost like a guinea pig test bed for other overseas technology designs. That is expensive and it doesn't really serve our UK energy security particularly well either. So more people shouting from the rooftops about atomic energy, and industry having those conversations with government about how we can do this in the safest, most cost efficient, most skills beneficial and levelling up kind of way.
Okay, thanks very much, Trudy. Lindsay?
Yeah, there was actually something I did want to come in on. That is, I do want to second a lot of what Trudy just said. And also one of the points I want to emphasize is that nuclear energy is a technology which has universal appeal, and appeal which in particular transcends party lines. Because I mentioned earlier of the Mesmer plan in France, which really set the ball rolling on their civil nuclear fleet. That was, named for Charles Mesmer, who was a conservative politician, or at least France's analogue thereof, who recognised the importance of energy security, of having, a strong French economy. But the other side of that argument is also that, nuclear energy is environmentally sound, it is clean, it doesn't produce any dangerous pollutants that get released into the environment, it doesn't produce any carbon dioxide emissions. So I think, generally speaking, if, comms to the public was, perhaps more pervasive and more effective than it was, just in terms of being much more wide-reaching, I think you'd see genuine public enthusiasm for nuclear technology because, well, a panacea it is not. We're going to need a mix going forwards no matter what we do. It's an incredibly strong potential future component for our energy mix, and it's one which I think, when you face down a lot of people, as I do, who experience almost a state of despair about climate change, how we're going to adapt to it, how we're going to mitigate it, it's generally a very powerful cause for hope among an awful lot of people who have felt, perhaps a level of despair about the future that we're building for ourselves. And, the realization that, while things may not necessarily be where we want them to be in regards to the climate, the situation is not hopeless. We do have a position to go forwards. And so I think building public pressure, getting the public not just on side, but enthusiastic about new technology, making it a vote winner, will ensure that, whatever party is in power, that there's a very strong mandate to pursue nuclear energy and to pursue it in the right way, which, as Trudy has also mentioned, is a fleet approach. You build one EPR, it's very expensive. You've got to figure out how to do it. You've got to train the staff. You've got to build up your skills and manufacturing base. You build 10 of them, you can just transfer that from one building from one project to the next, to the next, to the next, which is also why it's so critical that Sizewell C gets the go-ahead. And again, it's just going to be a game of myth busting, building up enthusiasm, and ensuring that, it's seen as a valuable political constituency, as a vote winner, as something which, is going to be a very popular decision by whatever government in power happens to be making it. And to ensure that, whenever government does happen to change hands, that it doesn't become a political football. That's, no, this was a genuinely good idea. We don't care that such and such party put it in place. We're going to continue it because it's a good thing to do. So I think building up a long-term, sustainable and enthusiastic sort of like public pressure for nuclear energy is the best way to influence government, whatever that government may be. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Lindsay. Charlotte, anything you wanted to contribute on this point about how we influence government and how government can be influenced?
Yes, certainly. I mean, politics is the language of priorities at the end of the day. And I think it's very clear when you speak to some colleagues who, as far as they're concerned, they don't have a nuclear footprint in their constituency. Now, we all know that that isn't the case. You only have to look at the excellent data that NIA puts out every year about how many jobs are in each constituency, in each sector, in each part of the supply chain, and the fact that, nuclear is something that benefits the entire country, not only in terms of our energy security, not only in terms of decarbonisation, but actually in terms of, the local employment picture in all of these places. And I think one of the really key things that needs to happen is for more members of parliament to be not only made aware that actually they do have a constituency interest in nuclear, but also to hear from those constituents with that constituency interest. So my challenge to employers on the call is to be saying, fill up the mailbags of your local MPs, help your employees with, sort of model letters underlining the urgency of some of the decisions that need to be made in the lead up to September, particularly around projects like Sizewell C, the EDF are not going to keep putting money into forever if the government don't take the decisions that need to be taken soon. Because ultimately, from my point of view, it's not that bad decisions have necessarily been taken around nuclear. It's that no decisions have been taken. So it's this kind of inertia that ends up being deciding on something else because you haven't taken the steps that need to be taken. And I, welcome a lot of the points that Trudy made around some of the commitments the government has so far given over the last 2 years. Certainly we are seeing some progress, but it's not quick enough progress in my view. And I think what really needs to happen is that the urgency needs to be captured. And the best way to do it, I always give the example of during the previous lockdown, in the weeks in the lead up to the end of it, I must have had 400 letters about allowing fishing to start again. I must have had probably 800 letters and emails about the beauty industry, both areas that, if I'm honest, I hadn't particularly given an awful lot of attention to, because I was more focused on some of the bigger sectors in my area, talking up about their interests and so on. But I noticed over the following couple of weeks in Parliament, because I'm sure that every other MP can tell you a similar story, the amount of MPs who were falling over themselves to talk about fishing and how important it is, to talk about how, the beauty industry is, the sort of bedrock of their local high streets. That's what people need to understand that nuclear is, who don't already understand that. And I think as much as it's about the PR part for the wider public, I think it's actually for people who work in the industry to write to your local MP. As I said, I've probably got somewhere around 4,500 people that work in my constituency in the civil nuclear sector, but a lot of them don't live in Warrington North. So they need to be writing for their MP for Warrington South, their MP for Halton, their MP for, wherever they're coming from in the region, if they don't live in my constituency, to let them know that actually, okay, maybe they don't have, a nuclear site or a nuclear employer in the constituency, but they sure as shit have got a lot of nuclear workers there, and they need to make sure that they're representing their interests.
Great, thank you, Charlotte. Ben, anything that you want to add as the non-politician on the panel?
I guess for people who are in the nuclear industry, please don't start the conversation with your hands tied. We hear people always coming out about the safety of nuclear. We have the stuff where people are forewarning of all the sort of arguments that we are concerned about. And as technical experts, I am concerned about the whole fuel cycle. I'm concerned about the societal impact of jobs, a whole range of bits and pieces in this story. But often people go with their hands tied, and they either go aggressively at the renewables industry, which if we think our end goal is towards decarbonisation, that is a false win. So please stop downplaying wind, stop downplaying solar. They are making 5% of UK electricity right now is coming from solar. So those things are super important in our COP26 plan and commitments towards net zero. The next thing is people and outreach. Your outreach starts, so my biggest influence is with my family and friends. My next biggest influence is my place of work, and that's the students I teach. The next beyond that are sort of people who I'm doing outreach and engagement. I do stuff at Imperial College Great Exhibition Road Festival, discussing nuclear power with 26,000 people from nominally across London and the Greater London region, actually telling people what happens when they switch the light switch on. So public attitudes is a great way to start the conversation. Most people don't actually care because it's not of their priorities. Going back to, I think Charlotte had a really great comment, politics is that thing, it's about priorities. People just simply do not care. They just trust that it will happen. The UK, we have not suffered brownouts since effectively when coal was being switched off, well, hugely significantly switched off. We haven't suffered brownouts for years. We just see the frequency flutter a little bit from here and now. So that priority is not there. I guess the other bit is that there's a care and caveat in the political spectrum of the values alignment. This is more seen in this data in the literature from the US, that if we're talking about nuclear and we're talking about its opportunities, you have to hit the green credentials, which is one side of the political aisle in some respects, of the sort of social justice, etc. And you're also trying to hit the sort of security of supply. You're also trying to hit things about jobs and economy. They are two different dialogues in this multi-pronged attack, where the end goal is decarbonisation, to stop heat waves, to stop extreme weather events, those things where the Thames barrier will no longer be sufficient to protect the 8 million or so people living in the Greater London region and beyond. And of course, that's again in London focus. There is also clear issues associated with coastal regions, with those populations are smaller and less represented across the UK. They are going to be hit just as badly and differently in these overall narratives. So it's multi-pronged. Think about the values alignment. Don't start with your hands tied.
Great, thank you very much, Ben, and thanks everybody for your answers to that question and your suggestions and priorities. I'm going to change the sort of subject a little bit now. There's a lot of questions that have come in on a range of different things, but one of the ones which came in on the chat from David Dundas is about hydrogen. I think Trudy mentioned hydrogen and the significant amount of electricity that will be required. But David's question is asking about what role people on the panel see for high temperature steam electrolysis to produce green hydrogen, and therefore doing it in a more efficient and less costly way than is currently available. If I start with you, Ben, on that one, and then see if anybody else wants to comment on that.
So hydrogen is super exciting and everybody gets excited for lots of very good reasons. So just a very brief story, hydrogen is a way for us to displace. So we've got to convert energy from one form or another to something that's usable. Hydrogen enables us to temporally and spatially displace that electricity or energy generation. By that I mean we can generate it at a nuclear power plant that is sort of clean and green and move it then across to a regional area, for instance, where we want to do exploration for mineral extraction, which would currently being done with polluting diesel generators in places of outstanding natural beauty, etc., in those sort of stories. So we have that hydrogen piece, we have different ways we make it. One, the dirty way of making hydrogen, I forget the colors in this story, but the dirty one is to take fossil fuels and reduce those. So we take the long chain hydrocarbons, we strip the hydrogen off in reformers, and we produce hydrogen that we can then use, but we still have that production of CO2. The benefit though is that we could perhaps lock away that CO2 through carbon capture and storage at plant. It is not there yet, not yet there, sorry, of these things, but it is an opportunity. The ways beyond that are to take effectively direct electrolysis, split some water. You did this at school, you popped a balloon eventually in that experiment. But to do that, often it's very inefficient if you do it from, say, a renewable technology. Just the thermodynamics, the fancy science involved is a bit more energy inefficient. You're getting about a third reduction in that electricity production. The other opportunity, as mentioned, is that we can effectively do hydrogen production at high temperature, which is to create effectively more efficient hydrogen production. That is a huge opportunity for what's called the very high temperature and high temperature reactors. We want to do this above 800 degrees C. It's a next generation technology. The key thing here is that having those skills in advancing nuclear generation of technologies enables us to have access to those things like the very high temperature reactor, one of which is deployed in China at the moment, which is a huge developing nation in the nuclear technologies. So this is a huge aspiration. It's really important in that story to create that sustainable investment in a green future. It's a tomorrow problem in some respects, but that doesn't mean we can't have the tools to address today, which is investment in new build, which is investment in small modular reactor, which is investment in R&D in these particular sectors. If we don't have hydrogen on our story, we are not going to create a net zero scenario moving forward. So we have to keep hydrogen in mind. The other thing is that we have a huge amount of existing infrastructure that enables us to have that migration through a smooth and just energy transition. And in that particular story, it's about gas pipelines, it's about the distribution and transport, it's also about moving it across the world and things about like ammonia production and other bits and pieces in that technical story. Again, I can nerd about this for ages. We're developing a huge amount of work in Canada. In BC, there's a BC hydrogen strategy. So our sort of equivalent to England in a country, BC is pushing forward in a hydrogen strategy on top of the Canadian one. And I'm excited to see UK stories in this space as well. So I've talked way too long, but I love this story.
Okay, great. Charlotte?
Yeah, I mean, you know, Ben's obviously given us a sort of outline of the sort of sciencey bit, and I won't try to sort of come in too much on that side of things. It's very much his area and not mine. But I think from a public policy point of view, it's, as Ben said, about developing that sustainable framework for green energy. So one of the things that I get a lot speaking to some of the companies that are involved in the hydrogen space is, you know, we've got companies that are making hydrogen trains, for example, hydrogen ambulances, because of course, you know, you don't want them off the road to be getting charged like a normal electric vehicle. You know, you need to be able to put one of those fuel cells in and get them straight back out, you know, but they're saying, well, we could be doing so much more in this space, but the problem is that there's not enough hydrogen in the system to make it something that's scalable. Then you speak to other companies, including National Grid, you know, who are saying, well, we've got facilities that could be storage facilities really easily, you know, but our problem is, again, that there's not enough hydrogen. And then you speak to companies that could be producing the hydrogen who say, well, you know, we'd love to be producing it, we could do this much, but there's nowhere to store it and there's not a market for it in the UK yet. And I think that, as Ben said about the fact that some of these are kind of tomorrow technologies as opposed to ones that are directly here now, that fundamentally, you know, creating that ecosystem where hydrogen can be created through a number of different means, many of which are as a kind of synergy with the nuclear sector, means that actually it allows the hydrogen sector the space to grow and to develop. And so I think it's really clear that when we're looking at energy, that as much as we're saying that, of course, nuclear has to be part of a net zero future, that we're looking at it not just as nuclear in a kind of silo, but nuclear as part of that wider energy framework, because it doesn't only benefit the electrification aspect with the electricity that's being generated, but also provides huge opportunities in gas. I mean, you know, we could literally at the moment put about a 20% blend of hydrogen through our existing gas network without needing to change a single thing in anyone's homes, without needing to change any of the pipework, whatever, and you could have 20% less emissions in heating in homes tomorrow. The problem is we don't have the hydrogen to do it. You could get it right up to, with some small changes, something like 99.8% or something, because you need to have a little bit for colorants and odorants in hydrogen, because obviously you can't see it or smell it. So it'll never be right at 100%, but it'd be, you know, pretty darn close. But again, without investing in the next fleet of nuclear, without investing in all the science and innovation and expertise that we have in this sector, you're never going to get a hydrogen future to go alongside it. Those two things are very much interwoven in my view.
Great, thanks very much, Charlotte. Lindsay? You're on mute, Lindsay.
My apologies. I do apologize for that. It's honestly a really interesting field of development, and I've actually had some of my own assumptions challenged about what hydrogen is capable of doing, because as anyone who's studied a little bit of material science will know, hydrogen is a little bit of a nightmare to work with. It's difficult to store, it'll attack a lot of metals, but there's already been existing work, as has been touched on before, to harden the gas network for the transportation of hydrogen. For instance, low and medium pressure lines are starting to be constructed using, I forget what blend of plastic it is, but one which is not susceptible to hydrogen attack. But yeah, as Charlotte has mentioned, the issue is we don't have the production. And personally, I'm not quite so gung-ho on hydrogen as perhaps the hydrogen sector would like me to be, but it is a fantastically useful intermediary for all kinds of chemical processes which currently depend on overwhelmingly fossil carbon. And the one which leaps out to me most of all is steel production, which requires a steady supply of very high purity carbon at the present, which is overwhelmingly derived from coal. And hydrogen in sufficient volumes offers an almost direct substitution using a process called direct reduction. But again, the problem is producing the hydrogen. And there's some who might, draw sort of like conspiratorial links about, oh, hydrogen's just a stalking horse for gas. And true, there were some PR stunts which didn't mention the hydrogen came from steam reformation. But as a technology class, I think it is an area where, applying nuclear technology to it suddenly makes all the pieces click together, as with so many other things. Because even though, high temperature reactors are still emerging and things like the sulfur iodine cycle, which requires high grade heat, and a lot of it is still somewhat immature, it is something we should be investing very heavily in because it does allow the almost direct reuse of an awful lot of existing infrastructure. And I mean, I've mentioned briefly sort of like domestic heating and cooling previously, and I think perhaps bidirectional heat pumps powered by electricity are the way to go. The reality is there's an awful lot of commercial customers who presently use gas, have existing gas infrastructure, and being able to substitute in hydrogen in bulk, in mass, that's, potentially an incredibly promising development and one we should pursue. But again, to do that, we need a dependable, always-on, steady source of high-grade heat and electricity to produce this hydrogen, whether it be by electrolysis or some high-temperature chemical process. And to be honest, I think, it's an ongoing area of research, and it's one which deserves an awful lot of support going forwards to ensure that, this technology is carried through to the full potential it can offer. So that's kind of my thoughts. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. Trudy, we obviously know that the hydrogen's one of the things which is ministers in BEIS have been talking about a lot. You're on the APPG as well, and I think hydrogen strategy is due sometime relatively soon. I'm not sure whether it's going to be ahead of the recess. It might not be. It might be just afterwards. But there's quite a lot of talk about hydrogen in government, isn't there?
Yeah, and the Transport Decarbonisation Plan also referenced hydrogen. In fact, just about every meeting I'm in, it was mentioned at Cabinet, talks about hydrogen. But I do note that the industry keep then telling me that hydrogen isn't the silver bullet. So, this conversation is most definitely ongoing. My point earlier was the reality that we are absolute world leaders in gas-cooled high-temperature reactors, or certainly gas-cooled nuclear reactors. I think we had the very first one, and that was my first job working at B55 next to the commonly known golf ball, or the AGR, on Sellafield site. But all of the reactor power stations that I referred to are AGRs. So we've got this expertise, but we're decommissioning so many of the power stations. And that's why I think it's so important that places like Hartlepool and Heysham and Hunterston and Hinckley and Torness and Dungeness really lobby hard to be sites for future high temperature reactors. Now, I recognise that, this production capability for hydrogen can also be through steam turbines, and somebody mentioned about gas power stations. But as this is a conversation focused on nuclear, I think it was Mike Case made the point that in order to have that capability, you've got to have a nuclear capability. You're absolutely right, Mike. But the more reasons that we can find a kind of priority for championing nuclear, the better. And I suppose that's what I'm trying to do by calling for hydrogen production capacity through high temperature gas-cooled reactors. capitalizing on our already world-leading expertise, on our decades of track record, but thinking about the future of the thousands of potential job losses there will be in those communities if we don't find a new use for the expertise and knowledge in gas-cooled reactors. And I just wanted to also add that, Ben, you are my current dream dinner date. If only science lessons were half as interesting, I would have probably furthered my career in one of your lectures. Brilliant.
Great, thanks, Trudy. I mean, it's just on the point you're making about the transport decarbonisation strategy, I think you'll know this. We're very disappointed that that when talking about that and the requirement for power to produce the hydrogen effectively, that it referred to hydrogen from offshore wind and renewables, didn't refer to nuclear at all. And we've been, as you know, bashing away for ages about helping people understand that green hydrogen, the point about the colour is that you don't produce carbon emissions for the electricity that produces the hydrogen. So there's a bit of a false distinction, but we still seem to struggle, I think, to get some bits of government that aren't based to feel comfortable with using the word nuclear in any way.
I think we actually struggle. I think we struggle in BEIS as well, if we're honest. It's complicated. It's still not universally approved by the public and probably never will be, but we could certainly improve that attitude survey from 4 out of 10 up the way. And anybody with an organisation invested in nuclear energy, invite the movers and shakers, the decision makers to your premises, because one of the most exciting things in probably any MP's career is the day they get to visit a nuclear power station. When you do what we do for a living, the opportunity to visit a power station is unbelievably exciting. And I would just encourage anybody with that ability to reach out and invite people to learn about what you do. It's probably the single greatest influencer you could do.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much for that. For those interested in hydrogen, there's quite a lot of comments coming in on the chat, which people might want to have a look at, and different views and perspectives on that. But again, I'm conscious of the time, so I want to move on to a slightly different area of discussion. So there's a question that Darren McClure has asked, and it's one you can broaden out, I think, but it's using Hinkley Point C as the reference point in terms of cost, and the cost of paying about half of the cost of Hinkley is the cost of paying the interest on the loans EDF have taken out to finance the project. So with that being consumers via their bills, a lot of it's going to the banks and other lenders. If you take out the cost of finance, the cost of electricity from Hinkley Point C is more like £40 per megawatt hour as opposed to £92 a megawatt hour. Begs the question, what more can we do to encourage alternative financing models? We know that the RAB model, there was a consultation the government ran. We know that in the white paper, there's a commitment to, well, there are ongoing discussions in relation to Sizewell that are focusing on RAB or elements of a RAB type model. But I suppose there's a wider point as well, isn't there, which is the thing which has been referenced a couple of times when the green finance bonds were announced the other week. The Treasury specifically excluded nuclear. How do we get to a point where financing mechanisms which are designed to help to stimulate investment in zero carbon or green sources of power and other infrastructure include nuclear rather than find ways of trying to exclude it? I don't know who anybody wants to go first on that sort of broad subject area. Charlotte?
Yeah, I think the point about financing is absolutely correct. I've made the point to the government in question that for some reason, nuclear financing seems to be more complicated than nuclear physics. It's baffling to me that this is the thing that is causing the most problems. Now, from my own personal point of view, I think we need to be much more proactive about direct state investment, because fundamentally this government seems to be happy to have our nuclear sector owned by other governments, but not owned by our own. So if it's an issue of government control, why is it better that the French government has a stake in it than us having our own? And likewise with some of the investment that we've seen being offered, particularly through China. You know, again, why aren't these decisions that we're taking here ultimately? I think, as I mentioned earlier, around the fact that the employment multiplier from the nuclear sector is by far and away the highest of any form of zero or low carbon energy generation. I think it's about 1.56 directly versus 1.08 for onshore wind, for example. You know, clearly this is something that every pound that the government directly invests in the sector is going to have a massive dividend backwards. And I think, you know, certainly at the moment, as we look about how to build back better, how to level up the country, you know, ultimately that kind of industrial strategy, looking at really key strategic sectors, whether it's nuclear, whether it's steel, for example, you know, I think the government needs to be willing, frankly, to put its hand in its pocket to finance it. Now, you know, I realise that for ideological reasons, different people are going to come from different places from that. But the fact is that the economics of it stack up, that the better the government makes the investment environment for private sector, you know, the more likely they are going to invest, because ultimately the government are asking the private sector at the moment to take on a huge amount of risk. You know, we've seen what's happened at Wildfire, for example. As I said, you know, we've probably got less than a year if decisions aren't taken before projects like Sizewell start to unravel. There's this real urgency here that without the government creating not only the policy environment, but also the financing framework that takes some of that burden of risk from the private sector, of course they're not going to invest. And we need to be looking at actually, you know, how we use some of the changes to procurement rules and state aid and so on as a result of us leaving the European Union and our accession into the GPA, about how we use that to build that more circular economy and to make sure that every pound that the government's spending is getting spent in this country 4 or 5 times over, rather than going to another country's government or another country's private sector, you know, to benefit people there.
Okay. Thank you, Charlotte. Lindsay?
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways that I've heard sort of like nuclear matter when it comes to building plants explained is companies don't build nuclear plants, countries do. And that by necessity involves, you know, a massive amount of state investment. And, you know, to follow on from an earlier point, you know, we are seeing state investment, but it's not the British state that's doing it. And when you look, you know, at sort of like geopolitics all over the world, you can see Russia and China are using their state finance instruments to finance nuclear plant projects, particularly of the Water Power Reactor for Russia and of the Hualongron and related designs for China. And they're saying, well, you know, you can buy this plant and we'll finance it. Here are the terms. And they're essentially using that as geopolitical leverage to curry favor with governments around the world. And it's a very effective strategy. It works. But Britain is really in a position where we have strong enough state finances of our own that it does beg the question of why is it we're not funding this directly? Because there was a recent conversation I was privy to about the nature of state debt, and essentially most of the debt which the government is into the Bank of England, which as a creditor is a very, very generous one, very low rates of interest. And what leaps out to me about Hinkley Point C in particular is, if the chart I have in front of me is accurate, in 2019 the strike price was 113 euros per megawatt hour, and of that, interest consists of 75 euros per megawatt hour. So 2/3 of the ongoing cost of the plant, of the ongoing cost of power, is just paying the financiers. And so what I'm looking at here is, you know, if you put this on state finance at, say, you know, 2%, you immediately at least half the costs of the plant. Because, you know, it's been mentioned before, you know, nuclear power is never going to be cheap, but it can be very, very affordable. And the way to do this going forward is you do, you know, use state power to say, we want energy security, we want, you know, our economy to develop, we want, you know, a lot of good, highly skilled jobs in a strong industrial base. And the way that you do that is you pick a design of nuclear reactor, whatever that may be. The EPR is fine, might not be my first choice, but it's what we got. And you build that over and over and over. And so the first thing the government needs to do is, through whatever mechanism they have at their disposal, make sure Sizewell C gets underway, because we have about, I think, a year before the industrial base that is used to produce the first stages of Hinkley Point C will get wound down because they got no more work. But if we approve Sizewell C, they can just get to work straight on doing that. So this is time critical. And following on from that, we also need, subsequent reactors to be rolled out. Like, for instance, Wilfer has been mentioned, how that project is, I believe it's currently, I don't know if it's entirely shut down, but it's at the very least stalled. That's a suitable nuclear site. We've got plenty of others where we've had plants cited before. So we really should be looking at saying, here is our national plan, here's our national strategy for the further rollout of nuclear energy. We're going to build a series of EPRs. We're going to build up our industrial base. We're going to finance this ourselves as far as we possibly can. And we're also going to finance, the development of our economy to reorient ourselves around this, cheap, abundant source of electricity. And, much has been talked about a green industrial revolution. There's been some, a lot of interesting discussion of what that could look like. And for me, that looks like we build current nuclear. We do that en masse with government finance, with government money, with government intervention, which is, the way nuclear plants get built, regardless of how they're financed. You need a government to back them up. The only reason the only reason Hinkley Point C is getting built at all is the government has said, we're going to back up this investment. And the private sector is still saying, well, this is still a risk. We want an incredibly high strike price. So why go through the middleman of the private sector? Fund it directly, make it a national priority. Countries build nuclear plants, companies don't. That's the scale of thinking that we need. And that's the scale of thinking that I think governments and the state is very well poised to put into place. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Lindsay. I don't know, Trudy, did you want to say anything in relation to financing? And, I know you're very familiar with what's happening in trying to move on from the consultation into RAB and how that might be something that's applicable for future projects. But
Yeah.
do you think that the understanding is there in government that the thing with nuclear is it's capital intensive, you use nearly all the money at the start, but then what you get for it for a very long time, for a very low cost, is something that is incredibly useful for national security and resilience and everything else that goes with it? Do you think that's something that's well understood, and therefore there is a desire to try to find the right mechanism? Would that be accurate?
Yeah, definitely. There is definitely a desire to find the right mechanism, but it's so much easier said than done. And I know that one of the greatest reasons people use against nuclear is the cost. So they'll cite Hinkley Point C over and over again as being prohibitively expensive. And then you have the conversation, but so much of the cost was the financing. And then you two come back to something along the lines of what Lindsay is advocating. And I think that's probably where we are moving. We probably won't see any more contract for difference methods used to finance gigawatt plus nuclear. We probably are looking at the RAB. But I can't tell you how disappointed I was when, on the one hand, the Prime Minister at point 3 talks about nuclear in its advanced modular reactors, its small modular reactors, and gigawatt plus scale, and puts money into it. And on the other side, you've got nuclear being prohibited from green gilts and not deemed a green technology worthy of investment. My hope is, I understand these decisions are reviewed about annually, and my hope is that there is a clear intention and a statement from government towards the back end of this year that will change in the future. I don't think it's realistic to assume that it could change before the next review, but some intent from the Treasury to say that nuclear energy will be viewed as a green energy will be helpful, at least, in repairing this damage. But it's not just in the way that nuclear is considered a green energy for investment purposes. It's also whether jobs in civil nuclear will be considered green jobs. It's about persuading Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, some members of Extinction Rebellion. I've had a number of conversations with individuals in Extinction Rebellion, and they are pro-nuclear. But we've still got those campaign groups which are successfully persuading enough members of the public that puts off investors and puts off other influential parts of society in getting behind nuclear. When we join, as I do, the many environmental Zooms and Teams meeting, and they're like a stuck record. What about nuclear? What about nuclear? If that power is generated by nuclear, would you consider that green? And all too often, the answer is no. So we've got a way to go to persuade the public. I'm like a stuck record saying this to you guys, I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Trudy. Ben, just to give you a chance to comment on that sort of range of issues, financing, etc., before we move on to something else.
I guess I'd start with the most, perhaps in my scientific career, and I've done some fun science, the most important meeting I've ever done was to present to a load of pension fund financiers in one of the shiny sort of livery company halls in London, talking about the legacy of nuclear with regards to what's going to be moving forward. This is really important because pension funds represent one of the largest private funding opportunities to effectively access money beyond a state aid-based discussion. I think one of the bits that hasn't been quite mentioned here is that the state aid piece, it needs to be capitalized upon the history, and specifically the coalition between the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats had an underpinning point that effectively restricted at the time the investment into the Hinkley Point C business model. That's not to abscond the Liberal Democrats or the Conservatives of that coalition of that decision. It did move us forward, but it did set up this very awkward strike price discussion where we're basically having that broken record. If we want to move beyond that, we have to create new financial instruments to enable this. And this is where that regulated asset base is that opportunity to enable us to build confidence in the private sector that there'll be a return on that investment, which, as mentioned, can effectively halve that strike price. We hear from the nuclear industry specific advocates, it's happening in the chat right now, different technologies being promoted as the next green technology. That is really important moving forward, but we go back to what is now and what can we access to build. The technology, actually, we're relatively insensitive to that technology, provided we talk about it in a careful manner with the right people and having the right values alignment in that piece. The little bit of that green credentials, and to give that piece to Trudy, and I'm sure she's heard this story many times, but I talk to environmentalists, and the first question is, what about nuclear waste? I'm going to address this in 2 points. One, nuclear fuel is hugely efficient. If you have a piece of fuel that is the size of my end knuckle on my little finger, it will fuel your home for 6 months. Actually, it will fuel an American's home for 6 months on that and displace 1 ton of coal. The legacy of that as it goes through the reactor, it will live for about 6 years in the reactor, do its thing, split, create lots of lovely friendly neutrons, smash into more and create more energy in a sustained and controlled nuclear reaction. But the legacy of that afterwards will produce what we call a vitrified. It's a glass waste bucket where it's locked up at the atomic scale. A volume the size of a Coke can, or other brands are available, but a soda can of 330 ml volume is equivalent to your lifetime's energy, not electricity, your lifetime's energy legacy. So if we think about that green credentials and that access to green gilts, that access to green financing to support the pension, that investment in our future, that Coke can of legacy is very small, very manageable, locked up at the atomic scale. We have the technologies to deploy right now. We have long-term, it enables us 100 years to 500 years. Right now, we have that technology in the UK. We have international for longer term support of that. We can do this. Why we're not is simply a matter of values. It's simply a matter of priorities. That is where we need to push that financing prong of this attack that goes along stream all of these other bits of the conversation in this story.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much, Ben. And yeah, there's a lot going on in the chat as well. People that are able to see that. I'm conscious we haven't got a huge amount of time left. I do want to move on to another subject, which is, I suppose, does fall into that category of thinking about future technologies. But I think it was Sophie Barwick, I think, had asked the question very early on, and I wanted to make sure that we got to it, because we're the Nuclear Industry Association, but we're not just about fission, we're also about fusion. We've got members working in the fusion sector, both down the road here in Culham, and working on ITER and everything else. And it's an area where the government, science bit of government, has invested significantly and is investing significantly in the UK at the moment. So I think the question was, where do the panelists see fusion, and how significant can that be as part of our future decarbonised society? Who would like to go first on that one? Charlotte?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and this sort of goes back to what I said in my opening remarks about, from my point of view, nuclear being something that's not just for the kind of next generation fleet, but actually something that is much longer term project, because I think certainly in my own constituency, we've got people working on that there at the nuclear laboratory. And, you know, my mind was absolutely blown as someone that obviously comes from a humanities background rather than a science background, just sitting there watching some of this stuff like, you know, it's incredible. But actually, do you know what? Even if that doesn't happen, even if it can't quite be pulled off, even if it can't be, you know, we can't get there in our lifetimes, you know, the amount of expertise necessary to, you know, even be having some of those discussions and ideas, you know, that's something that I'm sure other ideas will possibly crop up in that time as well. You know, from my point of view, there is no downside to investing in the research and development and innovation capabilities there, because it's the research and innovation capabilities that will be used across the economy, because of course, you know, people might move into different areas of science and engineering, or, you know, come across an idea in their development of fission technologies that can be used for other parts of the energy sector, other parts of engineering. You know, it's a win-win as far as I'm concerned. You know, we either get fission and that's fantastic, or, you know, we get closer to it, but in the meantime, you know, work out a load of other stuff. It's, you know, give more money to the nerds is my view. You know, the amount of money that we spend on research and development in this country is not nearly enough. You know, let's establish ourselves as global leaders, not just in this, you know, but in all aspects of nuclear, so that we can have really exciting and dynamic career pathways for our young people. But as I said, you know, we can decarbonize the whole world, not just our own economy, if we've got enough of a skills base there to have it as, you know, something that's exportable too.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Charlotte. Lindsay?
Yeah, I want to second some remarks about, you know, the sort of uncertainty surrounding fusion. I mean, the joke in sort of like engineering circles is fusion is 10 years away, forever. But honestly, I'm a bit more optimistic than that. I think it is something that we will crack. I think we will solve the materials challenges. We will solve the issue of not being able to get out more energy than we put in. I mean, obviously fusion works. If it didn't, the sun wouldn't exist. But in terms of something to rely on to get us to net zero, I put it in the category of we should put a lot of research and development money in this. You know, Charlotte is right. We don't spend nearly enough on that, and we really should spend more. And once we do crack it, it will make a phenomenal contribution, not just to, you know, the United Kingdom, but to humanity as a whole. But it's not something we can rely upon now because it doesn't exist as a commercial product yet. We haven't actually got a design tested, working, verified that will do what we need it to do, which is to produce a steady, dependable surplus of energy. We will get there, I've got no doubt about that. But in the medium term and in the short term, we need to put, you know, our resources into fission, because whatever we do, you know, we could stop producing electricity from current generation plants, you know, today. We'd still have, you know, an enormous backlog of spent nuclear fuel. Britain in particular has an enormous stockpile of plutonium from operating Magnox reactors for so many years. And with, you know, fusion is still an area where there is an awful lot to develop. There's an awful lot of potential to extract from it. So my attitude, as with everything, is, you know, this isn't an either or. We should do both, but we can't depend on fusion making any contribution to our electricity supply for as long as we don't have a finished design yet. We know it works. I think it will work. I think we'll get, you know, we'll probably get there by 2050. But even then, like, that's too late to avoid the worst of climate change. That's sort of like looking at, you know, challenges towards the end of the century rather than, you know, the start of the century where we still are. So yeah, we should invest a hell of a lot of money in research and development, but our focus on decarbonisation should be on existing proven technologies which can be deployed now. And that, unfortunately, doesn't currently include nuclear fusion. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Ben?
Super cool to hear the pragmatic but also optimistic views of my colleagues. I've worked a little bit on fusion. I used to be based at the University of Oxford that has long-standing collaborations with the Culham Centre for Fusion Energy, which is an international centre of excellence in this domain. We're basically putting the sun in a bottle. We're smashing two hydrogen, or actually tritium, deuterium together, two isotope, two flavors of hydrogen together on that. Smashing together, releasing from those bonding, creates energy through neutrons, etc. Huge materials challenge, I would suggest that ITER, this international project based in Cadarache in France, has created now a global economy in this particular domain for technologies. There is now specific expertise in sensor technologies to do diagnostics of the plasma, that bottled gas, where the, well, not gas, it's a different state, but like a gas that creates the energy involved. So there are effectively now economic instruments enabling us to get that technological development, which is actually creating huge interest. There are UK-based companies leading in this sector, specifically in the development of, say, superconductors that are amazing technologies to enable very high currents and magnetic fields that have extra benefits towards next generation MRI machines that enable us to have diagnostics in hospitals. In addition, one of the other really cool bits is there's a UK project called MAST, where they've done some really clever stuff. So materials is my expertise. I love it all to be a materials problem, although I'm slightly failing if it's always our problem. The other bit, though, is that we can effectively dissipate the heat much better through really clever simulations and computations to dissipate the heat across as this sort of plasma, this stream of very hot gas is going there. And that requires that UK-based experiment, a huge investment from the UK research and innovation towards that, especially in light of Brexit. And actually Brexit, Tom, I should be specific on the treaty that caused some of the consternation and challenges in this piece. Why I say that's important is that there is a global perspective. There is also a Brexit angle on the energy and nuclear sector, but there are beacons of activity, and I center on Culham as that piece, but they are of course one fragment, and the Culham colleagues work closely with colleagues at the National Nuclear Laboratory, with NPL and a whole range of other expertise, as well as the UK university sector, and of course the people who are making the steel, etc., and components in these pieces.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a lot in the chat talking about STEP reactor design, and people are bidding for that at the moment. That process is underway, and people referencing Moltex building a commercial molten salt reactor in Canada, the U battery technology that Steve's mentioned. There's a lot of backwards and forwards in that chat, which is quite useful, which I think demonstrates there's a lot of activity, a lot of life, a lot of interest, a lot of innovation happening across the piece in the sector. We're just about out of time, but I just want to ask each of our panelists, just to sum up, given that this is part of Net Zero Week, could you sum up nuclear for net zero in 3 words or less? And I'll start with Lindsay.
3 words or less. I've always liked split atoms save the world. That's a bit too long, but clean, dependable, reliable.
Thank you. Ben?
We can't do without it.
Can't do without.
We can do that
That's
one.
4.
3 words. I'll do a hyphen in white to hide it in the word count.
Charlotte?
I don't know, it's like more nuclear now. Maybe a thanks on the end if I'm allowed a 4th word. Or
More
a plea.
nuclear now.
No.
Great, thank you. And Trudy?
I dread to think where you're using these 3 words, Tom. If I'd had more prior notice, I would have been able to come up with something far more profound, but really it's just absolutely bloody essential is as good as it's going to get for now, I'm afraid.
This is our focus group. This is how we do a focus group in the NIA. So you'll see it in Nuclear Week in September in Parliament. Absolutely bloody essential. Quote Trudy Harrison. Thank you very much. Can I thank all of our panelists this morning for their insights and their time and being able to answer all of your questions, or the questions we've been able to ask. There's a couple we didn't get to. We'll try and get answers to those through to you. But thank you very much, everybody, for joining today. Thank you to Charlotte, to Trudy, to Ben, and to Lindsay for being on the panel. And as I said at the start, part of Net Zero Week, and you can go onto the website, which I've now forgotten. I did say it earlier. I can't find my note that says what it's called, but it's
netzeroweek.com.
Thank you, Tom. Net Zero Week, the voice from the gods. netzeroweek.com. Go on there, and there's plenty more going on during this week. But thank you, everybody, for your time this morning. Thanks very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.